Well, thank you for that introduction. Like Liz said, my name is Amy Thompson, and this is my colleague, Courtney. And we're grief counselors with the Safe Crossings program. And my hope for this webinar is that you'll feel supported in your own grief and loss, and that you'll have a better awareness of how your grief may be affecting you. Then we'll talk about how grief impacts children, both in some similar ways as to adults, and there are some key differences we'll discuss. And finally, we'll share some ways that you can help support your children in their grief. There will be time for questions at the end, but please feel free to use that chat box for any comments or questions as they come up for you. Courtney will help me become aware of those as they come up, and I'd love to just answer those as we go along. So as a grief counselor, my work really focuses on bereavement after a death. However, we know that all change creates loss, and particularly during this pandemic, many of us are going through all types of changes and losses that are compounding and building on each other. And, you know, one thing I hear from many people is they say, like, well, you know, my situation isn't as bad as so-and-so, or, well, everyone's having it hard. And, you know, that's true, but all losses are valid, and all change can create emotional distress. So it can be really helpful to acknowledge our losses for ourselves. So on this next slide, I would like you to kind of look through these and, you know, keep a tally with a pen and paper or just in your head how many of these losses you've experienced in the past year. And if I've missed any, can you please drop them in the chat? So I'll give you a moment to reflect on this. All right, well, I wonder if there's, you know, the number that you counted surprised you. I think, you know, as we live our lives day to day, rarely do we take stock of just all the losses that we've had this past year. And it can be helpful to just kind of be aware of just how heavy the burden is that we're carrying, and everything that we've had to adjust to. All right. Well, we know that your grief is very individual and unique to you, the type of loss, the circumstances of the loss, any past losses and deaths that you've experienced, and other factors. We also know that there is no right or wrong way to grieve, and we see grief affect us physically, emotionally, cognitively, spiritually, and behaviorally. So in these next slides are listed many different common responses in grief, and it isn't an exhaustive list by any means. So again, if you notice things that we've missed, please drop them in the chat. And I'd kind of like you to just, again, keep a tally of just how many of these reactions that you've had. And my hope is that this activity will give you a better awareness of the impact of the losses that you've had and how they're showing up for you in your day-to-day life. So I'll give about a minute or so on each of these slides. Would you want to flip to the next slide, Liz? Thanks. Maybe the next slide. And the next slide. Well, thank you for doing that. And I saw the comment, it's hard to see others happy when we're sad. And I think that is so true. I feel that especially after a death, um, it can feel like your world has stopped, and it can be hard to see, everybody else living their lives normally, and that the world just keeps going on for them, and I think seeing others happy, sometimes it makes us that much more aware of our sadness, because our feelings aren't matching theirs. And there can be resentment too. There's a lot of things that are so hard and unfair in a death. um, and let's see this one. What length of time is typical for people to deal with various grief responses? Um, well, that is a really great question. And what really we see most commonly is grief coming in waves. And so you're never really done grieving. And it really is different for everyone how long those intense grief feelings last. Um, Usually, you can struggle for a period of time, and eventually a new normal kind of develops. And maybe you're not thinking about the person as much, and you find yourself having more enjoyment in life again, but then something will trigger your grief. You'll be walking in the grocery store and their favorite song will come on, and you might be kind of hit with a new wave. Or maybe there's an important event like a wedding, and that will kind of re-trigger your grief. So we're never really done grieving, but and the length of time really just is so personal to you and the circumstance. Yeah. And I'm wondering, like, how was it for people in taking their tallies? Were you surprised by um, how many that you'd experienced, or were there things that you saw listed that you've experienced but you wasn't connected in your mind to your grief? Like, you didn't know that shoulder pains could be associated with your loss. Um, how was this for people? Well, in thinking about these responses, um, children also experience a lot of these same behavioral, physical, emotional responses in grief, but they're not mini adults. There are some key differences. And the reason for this is that as children grow and develop, they're thinking about and experiencing and interacting with the world differently. So depending on their developmental age, their grief will look different. So for example, a 6-year-old who doesn't have real strong verbal skills, instead of talking about the person and talking about how they miss them, you might see them react, like show more aggression in their play, or maybe they'll have more tantrums, or they'll start wetting the bed. So or they may be more clingy. So you see it more in their behavior than you do verbally. And then you have a 12-year-old who is more verbal, and maybe they really do need to process everything, and they repeat the story of the death again and again, or share memories of the person. And then you can have a 17-year-old who they're very, very, very verbal too, but the main task developmentally for a teenager is to become their own individual person. And that's when they start really pulling away from the family unit. And so they'll talk about the death, but it's more common for them to talk about it with people outside the home. with a counselor or a coach or a best friend or a teacher. So what developmental stage they're in really impacts the way their grief shows up. I will talk about some key general differences with children's grief. Children re-grieve. So, for example, the concept of death can be difficult for real young kids. So, like a 4-year-old may not be fully comprehending, that this means forever. And then, but once they turn like 9, maybe they start reflecting on, my family doesn't look like my friends' families, and I go to their house and they have their brothers and sisters or their mom or dad. Or they turn 16 and they're thinking about how their dad isn't there to help them learn how to drive or won't be there for their graduation. And so each time, they kind of hit a new phase in their life, you can see them really missing and thinking and having intense feelings about the person in their death. In our program, it's really common for us to work with youth for maybe 6 months or a year, and maybe they're doing really pretty good when we stop visits, but then a caregiver will call us back a few years down the road and we'll need to start visits up again because grief has come back up for them. Children are really repetitive in their grief. So that thing I was talking about real young kids like 4 and 5 struggling to understand death, they will ask again and again and again things like, when is daddy coming home? Or they'll need the story explained to them again and again of the death. And it may not be that, you didn't explain it clearly enough the first time. It's just that's the way they internalize the information and really concretize it within themselves, is hearing those consistent, repeated, simple answers back. Children worry about their own safety and well-being and that of their loved ones. After a death, their sense of security and safety in the world can really be shaken. And you can have kids become really clingy. Maybe they really worry whenever anybody leaves for an outing and isn't back home on time. Their sense of security can really be disturbed. Children are really keenly aware of the reactions of others. I had a family where the spouse was really grieving the death of their partner and was crying, and one of the kids picked up a pillow and started throwing it at their sibling, and he was saying, "Stop crying, I'm acting up, so you'll stop crying." Like, he actually said it. And so they're reading everybody's responses. They're very aware of how everyone is feeling and doing. And they also have a great desire to fit in. So a lot of times kids won't want their classmates or peers to know about the death. They don't want to be seen as different in any way. And then they can also mask their grief at home too, because they don't want a caregiver to worry about them, or they really want to have the appearance that everything is okay. Young children are concrete thinkers. So we're really careful with kids to be clear about how, the heart stopped beating, the body stopped working, the person died and they can't come back. Kids can get really confused when we use other words for death. I worked with a young girl once where she was told, "We lost your sister." And this little girl thought her sister was lost somewhere and was really disturbed that people weren't searching for her. And she worried, if I got lost, would my parents look for me? Um, Kids are also magical. They have magical thinking. And when there's any type of hole or gap in their understanding, their brains will fill it in. And this can be especially difficult when, we think about how kids often feel that whatever is happening around them has something to do with them. So if they don't understand the cause of death, sometimes they may think like, well, I yelled, I hate you, and I wish you were dead. And so it's my fault that they died. So we're careful to explain to kids that there's nothing you ever thought, imagined, said, did that caused this person to die. And I kind of touched on this earlier, that children have regressive behaviors. So sometimes a skill that they've mastered in the past, they temporarily lose, like the bedwetting or needing help getting dressed in the morning. And then we also see kids kind of revert back to things that gave them comfort at younger ages. So they can start sucking their thumb. But we do see this throughout youth. So even teens, we'll see teens start to go to bed with a stuffed animal. So those regressive behaviors are really common too. Do we have something in the chat? Children's grief is different to their brain development too. I think that it goes hand in hand, the brain development. I think I think that's why, like, we see grief affecting kids so physically. They don't, I think a lot of times too, they haven't been taught language for their feelings. And so they may not even know what they're feeling, and you just kind of see this explosive, chaotic energy come out. So definitely both social development and brain development impacts the way grief shows up. So I want to share some ways that you can support your family. The number one thing is to take good care of yourself. You saw in those grief reactions that irritability or having a short fuse is really common in grief. Having trouble sleeping. And when you're already holding so much and moving through grief yourself, it can be so hard to support children who also have increased needs. It's really typical for kids to struggle in school and all these things that come with grief. So the more you really try to take that time for yourself for self-care or seeking support, goes a really long way to helping your whole family. Another thing is really modeling grief and labeling feelings. It can be really distressing for kids to see a parent cry. But it's so helpful to be able to say, like, I'm crying because I have this pain in my heart, and it's really healthy and good that I'm crying and getting it out. And it's okay to cry in grief. It's okay to be angry, and whatever feelings you have, they're okay too. So doing that can really help your children. Providing outlets for feelings is really helpful. Anger is so common with kids who are grieving, and anything you can do to encourage them to punch a pillow, stomp their feet to angry music, write down everything they're angry about and then tear up that paper. It's good to encourage them to get that out and to even say to them, you know, this is really unfair and I'm angry too. And it's also good, any type of art or symbolic play that you can do to just really help them understand their feelings and get them out on paper or in play is very helpful. And thank you. Provide opportunities to talk about or honor the person who died. I've seen many families set up an altar, so either like on the top of a table, or maybe they clear a shelf of a bookshelf and they put a photo of the person, maybe some of objects related to the person. It's nice to have a spot where family members can go when they're thinking about that person. And it's also kind of a nice acknowledgement of this person that even though they're not physically present anymore, is still such a major part of the family. Doing things like eating the loved one's favorite meal or doing something that they love to do, anything that helps that child feel a sense of connection to the memory of that person and keeping that memory alive helps them move through their grief. I've seen families where they have a jar or a box, and anytime someone's thinking about the loved one, they can write a note to them, or maybe they write a little message to their loved one or a memory. And sometimes families like to, you know, share those at special meals, or they just keep them or they bury them. There's all kinds of things you can do with that. Simply bringing up the person that died is helpful in sharing memories. I worked with a teen who told me, you know, we don't even say his name anymore. It's like he didn't even exist. And I think a lot of times in families, everyone's trying to protect each other. Nobody wants to make the other feel bad or bring up something that might be painful. But by sharing memories of the person and bringing it up, you're teaching your children that this is a safe thing to talk about. And, you know, it's a way of helping that child feel that that person is still a part of who they are and a part of their life. And the other thing I'd want to note is just it's important when children ask about the person who died or their death that you answer questions as honestly as you can. That goes a long way to helping your children know that they can trust you, and also giving them a good sense of who that person was. Check in regularly. So, you know, children often say that they're talked to and not asked a lot about what their grief is like. And, you know, in talking to them, it's fight that urge to put a positive spin on what they just shared, you know, instead of saying, well, at least you still have, you know, your sister, or, you know, think of all the things that you're grateful of. Like sometimes it's really helpful to just let them feel sad or let them be angry, and not try to change that for them. Being available while also allowing space. I know that can be tricky, especially with teens. I have found that car drives are perfect, and a lot of times teens will spill their guts on a car drive, and I think it's like they don't have to look you in the eye and in the face. Um, I've known families where they'll leave just little notes for their teens in their bedroom or in their lunchbox or whatever, and just continuing to keep that line of communication open. And even if your child kind of rebuffs you every time and doesn't want to talk about it, you are giving them that message that they're loved, that you care, that you're curious about them, and that this is an okay thing for you and them to talk about if they ever want to. Um, Family check-ins are really helpful. Everyone has different needs in grief. So some kids want, all their classmates and teachers and everyone at church and everyone to know about the death, and others don't want anyone to know at all. So coming to a consensus as a household as much as you can is really helpful. Um, Planning for things ahead of time, like holidays. Um, if there's a particular tradition that that person took the lead on, like dad always got the Christmas tree, talking about that beforehand with your whole family. Is that something, can we all go and do it? Or is that a tradition it's just too painful and we're not going to do that this year? Um, just having that chat together and planning ahead of time can mean a lot. Um, it's also really helpful to set aside time to do things as a family, like playing a board game, going on a walk, when theaters open, going to the movies. Um, Children can feel so alone and isolated in their grief that anything you can do to kind of help their sense of connection and bond to the rest of the family um, can really support them. And then finally, maintaining some structure. Um, Kids really can feel like their world is unpredictable and everything's out of control in their life after a death. So the more stability and routine you can implement, the better. Um, and it can be hard uh, just to negotiate, when do I hold them to an expectation and when do I not? Because I know they're struggling with their grief, like a child who's tantruming after a death, that's normal. But also by keeping some of those limits and expectations, that can give them a sense that their world is under control and their caregiver is in charge and their life is predictable. um, and within that structure, offering them areas for smaller choices to help give them a sense of control, like, would you like to eat this or that for breakfast? Would you like to wear this or that? Little opportunities for choice and control are helpful too. And we know that sleep and eating habits can really be thrown for a loop when you're grieving. But we also know that grief takes a lot of energy. Even when you're not thinking about the death, there's a part of your brain that's working away at it and trying to make sense and adjust to life as it is now. And most grievers can feel very, very drained. So the more you can keep yourself on a schedule and stay healthy and prioritize that, the better. And that's about it. I'm wondering if there's any questions or comments. And some of those questions earlier, if there's anything I could answer more thoroughly. Well, I really appreciate everyone taking the time today and especially on a sunny afternoon.
Sorry about that, trying to find the video. I'm going to put in the chat a couple different things for everyone. One is the Tahoma Wellness Supports website. And so I just want people to get used to going there to look for events, to look for any community resources, different things that we have going on. All of our different webinars are going to be available on our YouTube channel. And so I stuck that in the chat as well. I'm just going to keep it going. Why not, right? If you wouldn't mind, I'm going to put an evaluation in the chat. It's a Google Doc, and that just, if for some reason it doesn't let you access it, I'll fix it in just a minute. But that'll help me just know what's been helpful and what else we need to do for our people. And then lastly, there is a Google Doc on there that are all the registrations. So we have a bunch of other titles and things that we're doing with the wellness webinar. We've got emotionally supporting your your student through COVID, online learning, emotions coaching, student brain and development and behavior, and then Be Smart conversation about guns and safety. So tons of different things coming up. Feel free and register for all or none, or one, whatever works for you. And then these all will be available on our YouTube channel as well, so we can listen to it later or share it with somebody else if you feel like this is something that was helpful. Both of you, thank you so much for being willing to come and be with us today and just talk about grief. I know it's a hard topic, and we all need support around this. And I think just getting things out into the open to talk about what we need and ask questions is critical for our community. And so we're just really glad to have you.